Hello, hello. You've made it to chapter 20. We're going to be diving into economics and how does economics play into environmental concepts. If you're in economics or if you've taken economics, fantastic. Some of this should be reviewed. If you haven't taken economics yet, your future economics teacher will thank you, or I guess thank this class for giving you a sneak peek. All right, so let's get into it. The first thing we want to talk about, and this is kind of tying into what we learned about last week, in chapter 1, which is sustainability. We're trying to make sure that we're developing things in a way that we're not only meeting the needs of our current present, but we're also trying to meet the needs of our future generations. We never want to ever develop in a way that is depleting resources, but we want to balance our environmental processes, making sure that we have enough resources for future generations in a way that, again, is trying to meet our current social needs. And also, I mean, we're human, and especially in America, we're working on also making an economic profit as well. So we're trying to balance these three things together in our sustainable development. This can really be summarized as the triple bottom line. And this concept developed in the 1990s. So as we're making decisions, as we're creating new policies, as we're moving forward as a nation and as an entire planet, we want to make sure that we're taking in not only just the economic profits and factors, but also environmental and social factors as well. So we're going to dive into especially the economic and social factors. Those are our new ones for this chapter. So buckle up. We're getting into economics. Woo. Because there is not unlimited goods, and because we only have a certain amount of goods, certain amount of money in the world, we have something known as scarcity. Because we don't have an unlimited supply of everything, this scarcity is going to lead into a market where there's always somebody supplying something and somebody else demanding it. So we have an exchange of goods. And from this exchange of goods, we get what's called supply and demand curve. Supply and demand curve is not only looking at the supplier side, who is actually developing and giving me a product, but we're also looking at the consumers as well, which are represented by the demand D curve. These two are going to be balancing, and they're going to have varying quantities of each individual party, supplier versus demander. And that's also going to fluctuate the price of a good. So we're going to kind of look at each of these one at a time. So in the law of supply, we're really only focusing on this blue supply line, the S line. In the supply line, we're looking at a direct relationship where as a quantity supplied is given away, that's also going to have an increase in the price. So quantity supplies increases, so does the price. If the quantity falls, if we go down this line, going down the x-axis, my amount that I'm supplying is decreasing, that price is also going to decrease as well. That's going to tie into a lot of like competition between different people who are supplying the same product. And it's also going to talk about the availability of a good. So if I have a huge quantity supplied, a lot of availability of a certain good, I'm going to be able to raise my prices quite high because I'm having a lot of income coming in. If I'm selling a lot, I'm making a lot of income. Also, as my quantity increases, that means I'm probably having bigger machines, larger staff. I'm making my process more efficient, which means that I can charge a higher price for my goods. In contrast, if I have much of a smaller business, sometimes maybe we have a lower price just because we're trying to build up that company. We're trying to build that up. We're trying to gain those customers. So that's our law of supply. Direct relationship, as one goes up, so does the other. On the other hand, the law of demand, we're looking at an inverse relationship, a downward slope. We're looking at the demand curve, and we're looking at the consumer's perspective for the law of demand. So in the law of demand, as quantity increases, the price is going to decrease. So the more and more that I demand a good, let's say like, oh my goodness, Teslas, I don't know. Teslas right now are very expensive, right? I don't know. I'm assuming I'm not going to buy a Tesla. But if Teslas are really expensive, but suddenly we're all buying Teslas and we're all demanding Teslas, because there's so many of us buying it, that price is going to end up decreasing. Because there's so many of us purchasing this product, the Tesla manufacturers are saying, okay, we've got a lot of revenue coming in, that price is going to decrease. In contrast, if there's not a lot of demand, let's say if there's something for a really, really expensive item, I guess Tesla's right now, Tesla's right now, the price is quite high. And so because the price is very high, there's a lot less of us actually buying it because there's a much smaller economic bracket who can actually afford those Tesla cars. But if the price were to fall, then that demand would increase. Lower prices, more people want it. Higher prices, less people are demanding. This is the quantity of individuals demanding it. We'll break this down more in class because I feel like these can get a little confusing. So hang in there if you're like, what does all this mean? This is just kind of your overview, introduction into the topic of economics. Oh, we've got a joke for you guys. What did the pirate say when he turned 80? I'm matey. Okay, so because I have this law of supply and law of demand, they have a really cool thing that happens at the equilibrium point. Now, equilibrium point would be the ideal price when the amount that is demanded from the consumers exactly matches the amount that is provided by the suppliers. This is kind of like, we're not thinking about taxes, we're just thinking about in an ideal world. Because these two match up exactly, we would have like a net exchange of money because this is the price when everybody agrees, yes, this is worthwhile for the suppliers and it's worthwhile cost-wise for demanders. We call this the equilibrium point. Now, most of the time, at least in America, our externalities are not taken into consideration. What exactly is an externality? Well, it's external of the price itself. So right now, when we're thinking about a price, usually that price just comes from how much did it cost to get the resources? How much did it cost for the employees who made it? How much did it cost for the packaging? But we're really looking at the good itself. Externalities would be external costs that are not associated with the product itself, but are indirect impacts. So for example, let's say I am making tennis shoes, and the tennis shoes machine that I have that's making my tennis shoes produces a lot of carbon dioxide gas, and that is causing a lot of air pollution, and that's causing climate change due to rising global temperatures. That production of carbon dioxide gas into my atmosphere would be an externality. That is a cost that is not shown or reflected in the price. So other examples of this, maybe we're using quite a bit of water. Maybe we're polluting the airs. Maybe I'm having to utilize lots of land space in order to harvest this good. Air and water pollution as well. So if I take these externalities, these outside costs, usually environmental costs, and I factor those into my price, do you think the price is going to increase or decrease for the supplier? The cost is going to end up increasing for the supplier. If they are being charged, okay, your tennis shoe making machine has a lot of CO2 gas. If there was policies, let's say, that said, all right, since your machine is causing all these pollutants to come in, we are now going to charge you a higher rate to produce your good to offset all the pollutants that you are producing. This is going to cause a shift in the equilibrium point. If this is kind of an ideal situation, but this is kind of a hypothetical one, if externalities were taken into consideration. So if now suppliers are being charged for all the pollutants that they're producing, if they're also being charged for all the land that they're having to take up, if they're also being charged for any solid waste that needs to be disposed of, that is going to cause their overall price to increase, which is going to shift my supply line back. Because the goods that I'm producing is a lot higher, I'm going to only be able to produce a smaller amount than I was able to, because now the price that I need in order to produce it is going to increase. Externality, higher price for the suppliers, therefore they have to produce less. The demand curve is also going to shift back because, as we talked about in the law of demand, as price of a good increases, the demand of that good is going to decrease. It's more expensive. Less of us are going to actually want it than when it was a little bit cheaper and we were lower down the demand line. When we're also talking about wealth and economics, we have two different ways that we can actually measure the wealth of a nation: the GDP, gross domestic product, and the GPI, which is the genuine progress indicator. We'll talk a little bit about both. The GDP is probably the one, if you've heard of either of these, that's probably the one you've already heard of. It's a very commonly used way of measuring the wealth of a nation. It is an incomplete picture, though, which is why we have the GPI. We'll talk about that one in a second. The GDP is looking at kind of in the export, product produce, and income lines of looking at a nation. So we're looking at a country and we're saying, how much money did you make in revenue? How many products did you produce? How many exports did you send out to other nations? So we're looking at wealth in that particular aspect. But think about, it's a very inaccurate way of measuring the wealth or the well-being of a country, because, for example, a very sick country, if there's a lot of disease, might show a high GDP because they're having to buy a whole bunch of medical products, right? So even though they're sick, their GDP would be very high because they're having to produce and buy all these medical equipment and medicines. So we also use the GPI as a more complete, fuller way of looking at the GDP. And a lot of countries are gradually making the shift from measuring their wealth in GDP to measuring their wealth in GPI. GPI is a little bit more newer. GPI is like the GDP, but we're now also factoring in, what is our personal consumption? What are our income distributions? Do we have a very wide gap between the upper and the lower class? We're also looking at wealth of a nation in how much higher education. What is the overall access to education for men and women? Is there a large difference between men and women education and job outcomes? We're also taking into factor environmental problems such as resource depletion and pollution, and kind of like the GDP did not, the GPA also factors in health of the population as a total whole. When we're looking at GDP versus GPI, we can see that GDP kind of, again, paints that incomplete picture. It looks like, at least in the United States, the GDP has been increasing like crazy stuff. And that's probably because America, we have increased our trade with a lot of nations. We have been developing more infrastructure, more efficiencies with product production, but we've also had some shortcomings as well. Our environmental impacts have not improved at the same rate that our economical sense has improved. So that GPI, this is our more accurate view of our overall rating, I guess, wealth of America. We see the GPI has been increasing, but it's not that seemingly exponential increase of the GDP seems to paint. And actually, a lot of countries are seeing that when they actually use that GPI, that their GPI has actually been decreasing because there's a lot of environmental impacts happening around the world that we'll learn about later this year. Oh, this is so cute. This kid was so cute. Look at him, he's so mad. She ate the Pop-Tart. Okay, back to the actual like science stuff, what we're learning about. I guess this is more of economics and history, but anyways, micro lending. So we've also noticed that as the overall GDP and GPI, education, wealth, economic investment of a country increases, their population stabilizes or even decreases, which is something we'll learn about when we learn about human populations. And so as a lot of the world is facing quite a bit of overpopulation crises, we want to find ways to help increase the GPI of other nations around the world. One of the ways that we can help other countries increase their GPI, genuine progress indicator, is through the process of microlending. In microlending, it's not charity, but it is a financial investment in lesser developed countries to help them begin to develop other infrastructures in their own country. So, for example, we have something called microcredits. We make a small loan, and it eventually is going to help that individual financially because we're helping invest in that individual in a lower income country. That helps them to get their business going. This helps an individual, absolutely, because we're giving them financial assistance. It's that financial investment. We're helping that individual grow and develop. but it also is going to affect the overall environment and the community as a whole, because as individuals are able to invest more in themselves and they're able to develop as small business owners, that's going to help with education, which is going to shrink the gender gap between men and women in those countries. It's going to shrink that education gap between men and women. If we increase women education, that's also, as we'll talk about when we get to human population, it's going to lower the fertility rate. At least those two tend to go statistically hand in hand. And it's going to help the economic stability of that area, that city or that town or that country as well, because now we're also helping develop them economically. So this can help increase that GPI of other nations. All right. So we've been talking about economics, we've been talking about wealth, and we've been talking about resources. I want to talk a little bit about when we're producing goods, what are some sustainable versus non-sustainable ways of producing those goods? So we have two different ways of looking at the production of goods. The top one is a less sustainable economy. And unfortunately, it's usually the one that is adopted by a lot of large nations, such as European countries and our country as well. America is 100%, like we're more on this top side, but hopefully we'll get closer to the more sustainable one at the bottom. So let's look at the top one first. In this one, the larger arrows mean greater amount. So we're utilizing and putting in a lot of energy, we're extracting a whole bunch of resources, and we're not relying as much on the natural ecosystem services, such as renewable energy produced by our planet. We produce our products from the inputted energy and from the inputted resources that we've extracted from our planet. We produce those goods, we use those goods, but generally speaking, a lot of them then get wasted away. We put them away, we don't have a lot of processes in place to actually reutilize those. So a lot of times these are going to go into landfills, these are going to be disposed of, incinerated. Generally speaking, we're done with it. So think about your cell phone, whatever cell phone you have right now, we're using your cell phone. And sometimes when we're done with cell phones, we just throw them away. Or if I use a plastic container for something, we can just throw away the plastic container when I'm done with the food. A more sustainable economy says, okay, let's actually try to rework how our goods production and manufacturing process happens. Let's decrease the energy that we're utilizing, decrease the resources, and we're able to have a decreased energy and decreased resource extraction because I'm relying more on environmentally sustainable resources. So we're looking more, let's say, on renewable energy, for example, or the natural genetic diversity that I can find in my ecosystems. If I'm relying more and utilizing more renewable things, when I go through that production and consumption, I'm able to decrease my resource extraction. I'm also able to decrease my resource extraction from minerals in our earth because we're increasing our ability to reuse and recycle our goods. So after I produce and consume a good, that is going to feed back into ecosystem services as we reform those goods rather than actually throwing it away. We also see this recycling happening where not all of it just gets thrown away. We actually take the goods, see what can I reconfigure with it? What can I repurpose with these goods? Like I've seen people take those giant, like rectangular storage shipping vessels. They're made out of metal. I don't know. I feel like maybe you've seen them, they're like huge, huge, huge. And people have made houses out of those. Why not? Instead of throwing away that metal, let's repurpose it into something new that decreases how many resources I need to actually extract from our world. All right. When also we're making policy changes, this kind of reminds me of that triple bottom line. We can take three different main perspectives or worldviews when we're trying to figure out the decision to make what's going to be the next policy we're going to actually put into effect. One of those is the anthropocentric. Anthropocentric, anthro meaning human, centric meaning centered. So this is our human-centered worldview. So it's saying human beings have inherent value, that they are inherently superior than animals and other species. And so when we're making decisions, we need to put humans first. Now, this isn't a bad one. I mean, especially if we're thinking about individuals, if we're thinking about the micro lending policies and we're trying to think of ways to help other individuals, Oh my gosh, absolutely. We need to help people. They are our fellow man. They are our fellow human beings. This is not a bad view, but I would encourage, if you are ever a policymaker, that you have an anthropocentric and also a biocentric or ecocentric as well. Bio meaning life. This is our life-centered worldview. This is said that humans are just one of any species. We're looking at all species as a whole. So this is going to be the ones whenever we're thinking about if there's a species, let's say, that is endangered or has at the risk of becoming extinct. Every species matters. Let's do everything we can to try to save the species that are becoming endangered or extinct. Ecocentric is the earth-centered. So not even are we looking at the species, we're looking at the earth as a whole. How is our overall climate doing? How is our resource reformation that's happening inside of the inner layers of the earth? What are we doing for the planet as a whole? How is my planet thriving and surviving? And what can we do to help that planet continue to develop? Again, there is no one of these that is perfect worldview. We really do need a bundle and kind of look at all of these at the same time in order to find the right decisions. But I mean, we're all just doing our best, right? All right, we got a couple more slides. We are almost done. A lot of world agencies are also trying to help not only our economics, but also our common man and the environment as a whole. Right after World War II, the United Nations formed. This is a group of many nations that kind of came together and said, all right, after World War II, we need to make some changes to really help each other out and rely on each other. From the United Nations, we have these 4 other kind of organizations, groups that are each aimed at different ways of supporting our world as a whole and trying to move forward in a good, positive direction. One of those is the United Nations Environment Program. As the name states, it kind of implies this one's going to be looking at our world as a whole. So what are some environmental crises that are happening around the world? What can we do as individual nations to help each other face and even overcome those environmental issues? This one's also focused on gathering resources and research on climate change and figuring out ways that we can mitigate those effects. The World Bank is going to be looking at the financial aspects of different countries, especially ones that are involved in the United Nations. And this is going to be where we see that micro lending, that financial investment in lower developed countries to help them increase their genuine progress indicator, or GPI. The World Health Organization, you might recognize from our Cats of Borneo activity. The World Health Organization is looking at the overall health of our nations, which nations need a little bit more medical assistance. How can we support one another? Let's say if there was a global-wide pandemic, hello, year 2020, and what can we do to support one another? Finally, United Nations Development Program. This one is looking at not only the environmental processes, but we're looking at how can we develop individual nations financially, health-wise, and environmental sustainability-wise. So for example, if we see that a nation has a lot of HIV, what are ways that we can help decrease the spread of HIV and AIDS in those areas? So we're looking at developmental programs to help the overall well-being of that country. So it's kind of a conglomeration of a lot of different ways that we're trying to support those nations. Whew. 3 more policies to be familiar with. You don't need to memorize these at the moment, but I would at least be familiar with these and the ones on the previous slide. Our 3 United States-centered ones are going to be the Environmental Protection Agency. This one, again, is the focus. What are we looking at? We're looking at our species. Which ones are endangered? Which ones are at the risk of becoming extinct? We're looking at resource depletion. We're looking at energy consumption and how can we mitigate those. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Hazard, right? Safety and Health Administration is looking at the well-being of different individuals at the workplace. So making sure, especially individuals who are dealing with a lot of toxic waste or radioactive waste, how can we make sure that we're protecting our fellow employees, our fellow Americans? Finally, the Department of Energy is looking at kind of balancing back and forth between that renewable and non-renewable energy resources. How can we make sure that we're decreasing our energy consumption in a way that will have enough for future generations? Friends, we are almost done. I promise, I promise, I promise. In the year 2000, that's why it's called Millennium, year 2000, the United Nations came together and said, we pledge by the year 2015 that we want to achieve these goals. Now, a lot of these, even if we did not completely get to it, like eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, I think we've definitely diminished it. I think a lot of these are still in the works, but we have had a lot of success over the past 22, this is the year 2022, in trying to help overall the well-being of our countries as a whole in the world and trying to improve the quality of life for everybody on this beautiful, beautiful planet. Last slide, environmental justice. We'll be talking about a whole bunch throughout this year because it's a very important topic. When we're looking at our countries as a whole and we're looking at the production and the usage of goods, and in particular, when we're looking at the waste products produced, environmental justice becomes a factor when we realize that there is oftentimes an uneven exposure or distribution of goods and hazards. So sometimes, depending on the socioeconomic class of an area, there is an uneven distribution, not only of beneficial things, but also of negative things as well. So, for example, unfortunately, we see statistically, and this is unfortunately true in America as well, people that are of lower incomes and also people who are of minority have higher amounts of exposure to environmental hazards. This can happen for a lot of ways. A lot of it, unfortunately, has come from a lot of effects from the events that have happened in previous generations, such as redlining. I know that ties into it a lot. Sometimes a lot of the individuals, especially those who are in lower economic classes, maybe they don't have as much of a voice or a platform, let's say, to advocate for themselves. And so they end up receiving a lot more pollution or hazards that are around their living spaces. And so it's important, I think, especially for us to be aware that this is a thing, so that if there are individuals who might have more of a voice, that we can really advocate for all these individuals and try to eradicate this disproportionate exposure to hazardous waste and to other things such as environmental hazards. Today, we are going to end off with a riddle, see if you can figure it out. I have cities, but no houses. I have mountains, but no trees. I have water, but no fish. What am I? Ooh, think about it, think about it. Know that you are awesome. I am so happy to have all of you guys here in my class this year. Let me know if you have any questions. Good luck with all of your wonderful endeavors, and I will see you guys in class.